I wanted to start by first thanking all the organizers that invited me to come here. I've always wanted to come to Portugal for a long time to actually talk to you guys. So I feel really lucky to be here. I'm glad I got so many people to come here. There's going to be a Q&A session at the end, so if you have any questions, just feel free to ask me at the end. I actually have a lot to talk about because it's really hard to compress everything into 1 hour, so I'm just going to start. And I wanted to start by these 3 words that was basically the first thing that I learned as soon as I started working at Pixar. And they kind of like ingrain these 3 words in you as on your first day as you start. And if you don't know, I actually started as an intern. So it's a pretty junior level position at a company as big as Pixar. But immediately when you're walking the doors, everyone is talking about these 3 words. And literally everyone from like the kitchen staff to the president of Pixar and John Lasseter and all these other people. So everything you do at Pixar is you do it because of story. So you always have to think about how important story is, what the message is going to be that you're going to be talking about. All the images that you're going to be working on have to be translating that story. And why I think this is important even at a computer science conference like this is no matter what you guys do, if you're working on an app or if you're starting your own company or something like that, you should kind of think about what the story of that is going to be. If you have an app that you're developing to somebody, you should think about how you want the audience to engage with that app. When they're picking up the phone, how do you want them to feel? And if you build that kind of connection between what you're actually creating, no matter if it's software development or a photograph or an image or a film, then you get a much better connection with the people and you get a much better successful product in the end. So what I learned at Pixar is precisely this, that story is always and should always be the most important thing that you kind of like should think about. In that sense, when I started like developing what I wanted to talk about, I wanted to like divide my talk into 3 main parts. And the first part, I called it roads. And this is kind of like the paths that I had to follow like growing up and going to college, and I studied computer science as well. And how I ended up somehow as a filmmaker, you know, because it's a pretty big career change. And the second part is going to be frames. And I'm going to go over some of my favorite shots that I worked at Pixar and kind of tell you like the behind the scenes of that and what goes on in my head as I'm working on something like this and what the whole creative team comes up to actually work on those. As you can imagine, like it's going to be pretty compressed because I worked on a lot of shots throughout my life, but I chose some of my favorites to go through, and I hope you guys like it. And at the end, I'm just going to wrap up by talking about dots. And I call it dots because it's just a way that I tend to see my life as, instead of being like a normal timeline view of what you achieved in your life. And I think it's really important to kind of like give yourself distance and see everything in a different perspective. So starting on Act 1, called Roads, there's one main event that started early on in my life. I was only 5 years old. It was 1984. And my parents brought a new baby to my house. And it was this little computer here. And it's, you know, I don't want to start a war between Mac and PC, Apple, PC, Linux, whatever. But this thing became kind of like an extension of who I was at the time. And I was only 5 years old, but I felt so comfortable immediately with, you know, MacPaint, a program that came on the computer that you could actually sketch and draw whatever you wanted. And that became so natural that it became huge in my life. And obviously, as a 5-year-old, you don't really understand how important that's going to become. But throughout my life, I always remember this event as one of the main reasons that I was so passionate about computers and so passionate about creating things on a computer. And partly because of that, I also became obsessed with this company in particular. And it was one of those things where I started following everything that Steve Jobs would do. Like, I would get home from school, and I would read everything that he was doing. I would read about like his adventures at Apple when he got fired, and his adventures at Next when he created this new company that was actually not really commercially successful. But more importantly, I remember as well reading in 1986 a little blurb of an article that he decided to invest in this company that was failing, almost bankrupt. And he decided to give personal money to this company because he really believed in what these guys were doing. Again, I was like maybe 7 years old back here. I had no idea what he was doing. I had never heard of Pixar before. But it's kind of like one of those things that happens, and after a few years, you look back and you realize how significant it actually was. And when I actually got to meet him at Pixar, and he keeps talking about this story and all that stuff, it was pretty amazing to see how everything in the end actually connects. So while all of these things were happening, I was actually always trying to do as much as possible with photography and film. So my dad has been doing photography for many, many years. And I remember as a kid, everywhere we would travel, and no matter where we would go, he would always have a camera with him. And he would take time to actually teach me what different lenses were doing and what aperture was and all these little details about photography. So as a kid, I was really interested in capturing images already. And again, I never thought that in the future, I would actually spend my life being paid to do similar things. But it was a big part of already starting to train my brain to see the world around me and all the little details as much as possible on that sense of technique, basically. And I was also fascinated by film, not only watching movies, but also just basically picking up a camera that my parents would have at home and film anything that I could. And it would actually annoy the crap out of them, but it kind of I would pick up the camera and I would unconsciously start seeing the world through a viewfinder, And I feel that was really useful, mixing with the photography that my dad was doing and all the stuff that I was trying to do with those cameras and all that stuff to kind of just bring a sense of the world around me and new perspectives on seeing how light works and how shadows work and how to maybe frame an image or compose an image. And all these things came back later in life when I actually shifted my attention from computer science to actually working in film. So these were all big events, small events at the time that became really big and really major in my life. One of the films that I saw was this film when I was, again, really, really young. And even though I could not understand what the film was about, it became ingrained in me somehow because one of the images that I loved was, for example, this one. And everything that Stanley Kubrick has done, and I don't know if you've seen any of his films, but you should if you haven't. And everything is perfectly composed to the ultimate detail, not only in color, but also in composition and in technique. And he would drive everyone crazy because they would take dozens and dozens of takes until he actually got the perfect image. And one thing about this film that I love is that you can basically pause the film anywhere throughout the 2 hours that it lasts. And really you have basically almost a photograph. So it's pretty fascinating to observe this. And I've seen the film now maybe 30, 40 times, and I still play it on my TV, maybe without sound even, just to kind of take new details that I've never noticed before. So he's been a really huge influence in my life. And in an image like this, what I love so much is I started immediately thinking about all the details that make the composition work. And everything you do in film when you're creating an image like this is that you're trying to guide the audience's eye to focus on the right part of the image that you're trying to tell that story for. So again, story is the most important thing. And no matter if you're doing cinematography or you're directing a film, you're always working on that. You're always thinking of that. And an image like this, it's so simple because it only has really 3 colors. It has white, black, and yellow. But although using the contrast between the black and white and the diagonal lines, kind of framing everything symmetrically into the center of frame, it really brings the attention to the astronaut. And it kind of puts you in place where he is there. So you feel that tension. You feel like you're part of that environment. And it's something that no matter what I do, I always try to bring that. So people like this, anytime I watch a movie, I'm always trying to understand what they did and why they did it and what the story behind it was. Was it an emotion or were they trying to tell me something? And it's really interesting to notice. And even now these days, you have modern technology that you put in a theater like this, and you actually put sensors above the screens where you analyze where people's eyes are moving around the frame. So you can tell exactly where people are taking time to actually notice the details. And you can kind of learn that and learn what people's habits are and learn exactly how different light and different color call attentions to themselves. And another technique that we actually use at Pixar a lot is to give yourself distance from an image. When you're working for so long in a film, at Pixar, for example, and on average, you take maybe 5 years to make a single film from beginning to end. You tend to see like the shots that you're working on constantly, dozens and dozens of times. So it's really easy to obsess over little details that no one else is going to notice. So one thing we do is make this like automatically zoom out of the image and give yourself a lot of distance to see the image in a new light. So that you, all of a sudden, you lose all the details of the image. It becomes like really blurry. And all of a sudden, you just really realize what's happening there. And you're only worried about 3 colors. And you see how there's like this circle environment inside. And like the lines are basically forcing you to look at this astronaut. And this makes sense. And it's one of the techniques that we use when you start working on a film at Pixar. There's 2 stories that you create. The storyboard artists are going to create a huge storyboard of like all the little sketches and scenes throughout the film. So the whole film is hand-drawn before anything else. It's like a cartoon before anyone else starts working on it. And it has to work in that sense because that's what's going to tell the story. But there's also like 2 groups of people, the art director and the director of photography, that sit down and go through the whole movie and create a color script, which is basically the story of the film, but in color. And it's so important because they create these thumbnails like this that are really simple. They don't have any detail whatsoever. And they just really show, when you look at it, it's like this huge panel. And you look at all these thumbnails put together, and you immediately see how the emotion of the film changes throughout, because you see where the warmer tones are, and you see where the cooler, more drastic, more contrasty tones are of the image. So you see the scary parts, and you see how time of day changes. And if the story of the script doesn't work in color throughout, then something is wrong about the story, because it's not going to work. It's not going to engage the audience as they're watching the film. So it's something that you really have to pay attention to. The next one is like, this image is another frame from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it's not a particularly amazing frame, but it still follows the principle of really guiding your eyes, follows the rules of thirds where you have like this symmetric composition and it balances these chairs on the left side of the frame with everything else. It has the lines guiding your eye and giving shape to the whole environment. But I wanted to show you this image because this image became huge in my life later on. And it's basically kind of like almost the reason that I went to computer science, to change from computer science to working in film. So we'll get back to this image later on. I want to talk about this film as well, which is another one of those films that I watched as a kid. And I was fascinated because this thing appeared out of nowhere in my life. And this was an effect created by Industrial Light and Magic in San Francisco. And they worked for 6 months. A team of people worked nonstop for 6 months creating this thing, which lasted 75 seconds on screen. So it wasn't a huge amount of work. Everyone got sick at the end, but they were creating something that has never been done before. And it's all made using computers. So this was kind of like the first time that, as a kid, I watched something that I was completely in awe of. I was so fascinated by this. It's showing a whole new world that I had never seen before. And it started like, in the back of my brain, started kind of like bringing all these passions about creating images that I wasn't really sure that I could ever do as a career. But I mean, look at this image. Now that I have much more experience, I can look at this image and see it in a completely different light. So not even their eye lines are completely matching the eye line of the alien. And that's really hard to do, especially then when there's no alien and the actors are not trained or particularly known to like stare empty space in front of them. So this is incredibly hard to do, and it's perfect how they're staring at each other completely. And in lighting-wise, I look at an image now, and I start analyzing, well, look how the light over here clearly separates her hand from the background, and it's all done purposely. So everyone who works in the film under the cinematographer is actually thinking about all these details. Because they're doing this connection, this really strong connection emotionally, you have to be able to see their expressions here. So you have this bounce light coming from here maybe. It just balances everything together, but you can clearly see their expression of awe looking at the alien. And as that wasn't enough, they even use this pipe over here to connect their heads, and that creates a complete spiritual connection between them, kind of like signifying that the alien is pretty much the same as those two guys. So these are all details that we use constantly in everything that we do. And when I get to the Pixar shots that I worked on, you're going to see this come over and over again. So it's one of those things that once you see, it's really hard for me to detach from. So when I watch the film now, I'm constantly analyzing all these things, which is really weird because I want to watch the film, and just enjoy the story, but it makes it really hard. In 1995, this film came out, and I remember watching it and just being fascinated by it because all of a sudden, the little article that I read before when Steve Jobs decided to invest in Pixar, it all made sense. And I was like, I cannot believe they just completely revolutionized film industry. They did something that has never been done before, and it felt like something totally new. And it was amazing watching this film. And again, it was one of those things that I thought, well, that's something really cool. That's something that I really love to do, but there's no chance in hell that I'm ever going to be able to work at a company like that. I had no qualms about it whatsoever. I was like, this would be really cool, maybe someday, you never know. But this film completely again, it's almost like when I watched Jurassic Park and saw dinosaurs for the first time, I was like, this is magic happening in front of my eyes. And it was so inspirational to know that a group of artists got together with a group of scientists, of computer scientists, and they decided to just create a whole new world. So this was fascination. It was totally fascination for me and really motivating. So when I finally decided to go to college, the first thing I decided was I want to be a computer scientist. That sounds like the coolest thing on the planet. So I did. So I went to computer science, and I did 3 years at University of Southampton. And after that, I graduated with that, and I still loved computer science, but all of a sudden I started realizing that there's a lot of programming involved, and I'm probably the worst programmer in the world. So I started getting a little bit scared, but it wasn't enough to put me away, so I decided to do a master's in computer science, and I still studied even more. And after the master's, that's when I had this moment where I call it the dead moment. And I was so scared because I finished my master's and I felt like I just spent literally a huge chunk of time investing in something that maybe wasn't the right thing for me to do. And it was really, really scary. But at the same time, weirdly enough, before I even graduated, I got called for an interview. And I got called for an interview at I think the company was called Accenture Consulting. I'm not really sure. And it's it was at the time this really big company in London, a consulting company. So obviously I was excited about it. I had barely graduated and I was already being called for an interview. So I actually went to this thing, and I bought my first suit. I had never had a suit before, and I sat down in the reception room, and I'm waiting for my interview to start. And the receptionist tells me, oh, we're running late. It's going to be in half hour. Just sit around here and relax. And that half hour was enough for my brain to just switch off. And I'm observing everything around me, and just taking it all in. And I started noticing little things about the room that I'm in. It's really modern, really spacious. It has a lot of details and bright red chairs like these over here. And it's just super designed. And instantly, the first image that came to my mind was this image again. And I was like, wait a second, this is kind of like 2001. It's pretty amazing. I wish I could do something like that. And as soon as I started thinking, then I couldn't get it out of my head. And I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. I don't want to go through this interview. I want to work in film. I want to be able to create these images that maybe somehow are going to inspire other people or are going to at least entertain them for like an hour and a half while they watch a film. So I actually got up on my interview before I was even called in. I apologized to the receptionist, and I said that I didn't feel I was the right fit for that company, or it didn't feel like the right career move for me. So I left, and I was never interviewed at that company. At that moment, that's when I basically decided that I needed to do something else, that I needed to follow the thing that I was always passionate about. And it was the scariest thing ever, but it was like the most liberating thing ever as well. I'll never forget that walk when I walked out from that interview, and I realized that all of a sudden my life was about to change, and I had no idea how, because I basically had to start from scratch. So this is a good moment to talk about these two words, because you're gonna, like, at least ever since then, I've done a lot of things that I've been afraid of, and I've done a lot of things that I failed at, and honestly, you guys are probably gonna deal with this a lot as well. And it's natural, and it's totally okay. And I want you to make sure that you need to embrace these things to be able to follow through with everything you want to do. So first, talking about fear, it's almost like there's really two types of fear, at least as an artist. And you can be afraid. You can be afraid of yourself. You can have your own fears, kind of like your own insecurities about yourself, always thinking that everything you do is going to suck and nobody's going to like it. And if you do that, then you're really, no matter what you do, is not going to be your best work. So that's the first fear that you kind of have to conquer and put aside, is that it doesn't really matter. You should always do your best work. You should always be trying your hardest to actually go forth and at least give it a try. The second fear is like fear of what other people might think. And if you're always worried about what other people might think of what you do, then you're never going to do distinctive work. You're never going to find your own voice. And that's so important, because otherwise everyone is copying each other, and people don't actually do like anything that advances technology or that takes a complete risk, you know, and Facebook wouldn't be possible, or Apple, or any other company like that. And failure is such a huge part in a place like Silicon Valley. Most of the companies that you see today failed multiple times before they were actually successes. Pixar failed, as far as I know, probably 4 different times. They were part of Lucasfilm before. It wasn't really working. George Lucas kind of gave up on them, so they went on their own. Then they started doing hardware and doing massive computer servers to render stuff, and that didn't sell, so they were almost bankrupt. And then they started doing commercials, and they did commercials, and it was kind of cool because they were doing new things in commercials, but it also didn't work. And when they were really completely bankrupt, Steve Jobs came in and gave them money. And they were like, well, let's try making a feature film. And Disney didn't believe in them, so they almost failed again. But they went through ahead, and they made Toy Story 1, which was like one of the biggest successes in the film industry. So everyone fails, everyone is afraid. And if you're not really afraid of what you're doing, it's probably because you're not doing the right thing. You need to take risks. You need to be okay with doing that kind of stuff. The other thing quickly that I need to mention is this. Everyone gets rejected. I still, after all these years, I've been in the film industry for more than 10 years, I still get rejected when I apply to jobs. I must have tried already 3 times or 4 times to actually work at Industrial Light and Magic. I've always been rejected. And it's totally okay. I don't take it personally. I kind of see it as, okay, maybe I'm either not the good fit to work at that company, or I'm not good enough yet, but I'm going to work on some skills that maybe is going to put me in a better position to reapply later. So when you think about that, maybe you're scared of applying to a place like Pixar or Frame Store in London or anywhere else you might want to apply. Like, just do it, because you have nothing to lose. And if you get rejected, just take it as a sign that, okay, maybe I'm going to work a little bit more on a few things, but I'm going to try again in 6 months, and maybe you'll get a yes. And trust me, eventually you get a yes. Even if you don't get for the company that you originally wanted, you'll get to somewhere else that is going to give you that experience where you're going to build those skills that you need. So rejection is like completely natural, and you have to like conquer those fears and just go for it. And I wanted to touch, this is a good moment to touch on this particular shot. This is something that I did for a short film called La Luna. And it came out with Brave about a year ago or something. Brave just won the Oscar, which I'm really happy about. But this short film in particular was really meaningful for me because it's precisely about that. A little kid that's like completely meaningless in his life, you know, and it's a coming-of-age story where he experiences something that he really finds himself in. And this shot in particular, where he's like falling in slow motion in sky, is about, it's that moment right after where something happens that makes him feel that way. And you can notice that not only in his emotion, because he goes from being slightly scared, not being sure that he wants to be there, but at the end, he's like smiling. And that moment is kind of like defines everything that I see, that I try to see in my life when I take risks, or that I hope you guys start trying to see in your lives as you graduate from school, as you start your new companies, as you work together or individually. It's all about these things. And just to start touching a little bit on the amount of work that goes behind creating something like this. This shot in particular has maybe 35 to 40 different elements put together. And I started working it maybe like on a Monday, and 2 weeks later I had to deliver it. So it was really intense. And it's all about the emotion, and the emotion is so strong, and this is such a powerful shot, such a huge important shot in a short that's like 4 minutes long, that you really have to focus on all the details that's going to bring out that emotion as much as possible. So not only do you have, like, it's really hard to see this, but the eye highlights are going to be a huge part of that. The eye highlights in a character in animation, it's almost like the soul to the character. And because he's like feeling such a powerful wave of emotion, we actually added like these expression variables that would make the highlights change in size really rapidly and kind of like twinkle, you know, a little bit. And what emotion that gives is almost like he's a little bit tearful. And you don't even have to have tears in the character. You just add the little shake in the highlights, and it's going to like create that emotion for you. And not only that, but you have like all these little details, like the big stars. Every single one of them has a bright core. And it's kind of like they're alive as well. We wanted to give that warmth inside each star. And the sparkles that fall in slow motion, how are they going to fall off? How long are those sparks? And how do they twinkle as well? And the glows, each star has a glow. Again, it's really hard to see this, but if you get a chance and watch it again at home on a DVD, don't be afraid of pausing it and just like notice all the details. When one of the big stars falls in front of his face, you see like some of that light like touching his face a little bit and illuminating him. Or that star over there behind his arm, the glow changes a little bit brighter when it goes right behind. And it's something that maybe realistically would never happen. I know, first of all, he would not fall in slow motion, right? But it's like, there's all these things that are not realistic, but make it more believable. And that's the kind of world that you create in animation. You're trying to create something that's believable, even though necessarily it's not realistic. And it's so huge. Again, this is like, you start by dividing the shot into 7 different layers in space from far background to close to the camera. And you play around with depth of field to really guide the focus of your eye. And then you start, each layer, you start separating all the elements. So each star has maybe like 10 different elements. It has the outer glow, the inner glow. It has how the light falls off from the center to the outside. And you create all these things in this massive node-based compositing software. And you create with expression variables and everything. And you keep playing it again and again and again. And you try to distance yourself and try to get the feeling that an audience member would see at a theater for the first time. So this is one of the shots that I created, and you know, it just brings it all together of like the feeling and emotion that goes after working on, you know, every film, basically, no matter if it's live action or animation. So that's the roads that I kind of went through, some of the major events that guide me to everything that I do now. And going into Act 2, frames, I'm actually going to start showing a lot of frames from shots that I worked on. And just think about it this way. No matter what you do, if it's a photography, which is a single frame, you're trying to capture a story in a moment in a single frame, what you're doing in film is doing the same thing, but 24 frames a second. Unless you're Peter Jackson, which is now working on 48 frames a second. But typically, it's 24 frames a second. And on Ratatouille, that was one of the first films that I worked on, like fully as a lighting artist. The director of photography was Sharon Callahan, and she's a total genius at knowing what every single pixel value on the image should be. You know, she can sit with me one day and be like, you need to add 0.02 in the red channel on this saucepan in the background, you know? And if I don't, like a week later, I show it again, and she's like, well, it's a little bit more green, you know? And you go back to your computer and you notice that you did the wrong thing. And what that gives you is like, you become really high detail oriented into all these things. But again, the red would be right because you know, you're talking about food, and in the particular shot, you want to like to make it really appetizing. So in a film like, a lot of times what you use is like, we either use a lot of Google Images, or we just go around taking photographs of everything and using it as reference. So a few years ago, I went to Paris. And Paris is a big part of Ratatouille. And this is like one of those things where you don't have to take like an amazing photograph to learn something from it. But in this particular image, you can really see how the blown out skies like destroy some of the information over here on the building. And you lose the sense of edges, but you see how the color saturation changes with the depth. And it's kind of hard here in this projector because it's not really calibrated, but you know, you see how the haze makes everything less saturated and less contrasty. And those are all techniques that you're going to use in animation when you're creating something from scratch. This shot in particular, it can show you time of day because the position of the shadows will show you that. And it's something that you have to worry about when you're working on a full-length feature because it has to be some continuity in space and time. Like, one thing that I want you to focus on is that building over there, because it's hidden over there, but it's actually bouncing off some sunlight on this wall and reflecting it back on that. And you use bounce light a lot because it creates this warm feeling that's going to shape characters and environments in a much more diffuse way. And it brings a lot of quality to it. So on Up, we actually used a lot of pools of light on the floor when they were in the forest, because it brought back some light onto their faces and created like really warm feelings to the characters. On this shot in particular, it's like I'm playing with depth of field, and I'm just like really using that to the max to just focus on that bottle of wine. And again, it's not a special photograph by any means, but you can start looking at the reflections, how they're going to work on the bottle of wine. Or even the glass here, how are the highlights being picked up by the edges of the glass or the surface of the wine. And it's something that I use tremendously in a shot like this. So this is a sequence of shots that I lit on Ratatouille. And it's really fast. And again, just to see how fast it is, this is the shot that I wanted you to look at. And this shot is 29 frames long, which is right over 1 second, like a film. And the film is more than an hour and a half long. This shot in particular, I'm going to keep playing it over and over. This shot in particular took me 3 months to light. So when I first started working on it, I rendered it. You know, I put some lights on, and I submitted a render. And the render took 360 hours of frame to complete. And it's a big problem. You cannot do that when you're working on a film. Like, we would probably be still working on Ratatouille if we didn't finish that. And it's huge. And why is it so complicated? Like, at the time, Ratatouille is already 7 years or 8 years old. But at the time when we're working on something like this, we're working on glass material, wine, which are fluid simulations, and reflections, not only of the environment, but refractions as well. And that's like some of the most complicated things that you can do when you're working in animation. And at the time, ray tracing was even more complex than it is now. Now that you have a lot of computational mathematical advances that you didn't have back then. But working on something like this, and when you shoot a ray of light, to see what happens to the ray of light, you're actually shooting in space, and it's going to hit the outer glass of the first wine glass, and part of it is going to be reflected, and part of it is going to refract inside. But all of a sudden, the glass has a certain thickness, so it's actually going to be another inner wall of the glass, and the same thing is going to happen. And then all of a sudden, you have a whole fluid simulation happening inside. So who the hell knows what happens to the ray of light there? It's really weird. And it goes through, part of it goes through the wine, hits the two other surfaces, and then all of a sudden, you have 3 other glasses to go through, outside. So this was particularly impossible to work on. And this is a perfect example of something that Pixar does tremendously well, which is mix art and technology and make sure that people who are really technical and technical geniuses and computer scientists and physics and everything that you can possibly imagine, the most technical people ever, they work together alongside with the artists to make sure that when something like this happens, everyone works together to finding a solution. So while I was working creatively, lighting all the other characters and trying to come up with creative solutions to light this, there was a team of people, of technical geniuses that were literally just creating this kind of software that shot rays of light everywhere, and they could in 3D space move around and see exactly what was happening every time they would hit different surfaces. So they could really implement a new algorithm for ray tracing that makes everything slightly faster. Now, the solution we ended up using for this was partly the optimization code that they did for ray tracing, and partly a solution that I came up with, which is attaching all these different cards right in front of each glass. And what those cards were doing was that they were actually taking a photo of each glass for every frame. So I render all that out, and I have a ton of still images that shows perfectly that glass on every single frame, just in cards. And then what I'm doing is that I'm bringing up all those cards back in, and instead of using those glass that you actually see, I just place those cards in space, following the hand movements, and using that for ray tracing. And that way, when the ray of light actually hits one of those cards, it's just picking a single value, instead of actually having to go through real properties of the glass and the material. So that saves a lot of money. And basically, it's money because working 3 months in a shot is really expensive. And all these reflections and refractions that you see end up being a total cheat. They're not real. It's just a cheat to make it work. At the end, after 3 months of working on this, we managed to shorten the rendering time to 60 hours a frame. But that was enough to, when showing it in review, Brad Bird got up and started applauding because he knew that this was an outstanding amount of work. And we actually had maybe 1 month left in the film. So another shot that I worked on, it's kind of bright in here, so it's hard to see, but this tablecloth is much brighter than those, and that helps guiding the eye to the center of the frame where all these guys are. And it's a really important image because it's towards the end, and Ego had just experienced something transformative in his life. And so you really need to focus the attention on this thing. Even the table lamps, these are darker, and this one is brighter because your eye is automatically going to go to the brightest value in a whole frame. And you play around with other things that you don't notice. I don't think you noticed, but there's a pool of light right here behind them, which kind of frames the characters where they are. And everything else in the room is pretty dark. So it's pretty cool because it gives you you're kind of painting with light precisely to tell a story and to guide everyone's eyes to where you want it to look. You don't want them to be distracted with anything else on the frame. It's just that specific space. Another sequence that I worked on is this one. And all of a sudden working on this one, you're kind of worried, all right, what kind of recipe are we working on here? Are those raw carrots? Have they been cooked before? Because everything changes. If you're working with cooked carrots, they're slightly more saturated and red and richer than raw carrots. So we had to find out what recipe they came up with to actually know exactly what state the vegetables should be in. And the turkey, like, was it glazed before? So, because if it's glazed before, the highlights of the lights in the environment are going to look slightly different than if it's not. But at the same time, you don't want it to be too rubbery. So you have all these like little things that you need to worry about. And then I'm vegetarian, so this was really hard for me to work on. And I was like going through Google Images, literally looking at turkeys and like everything to try to see how they really looked. And all of a sudden you have this emotion of claustrophobia inside this thing, you know, because it's an oven and he's going to be cooked and he might die. So you're playing with all these values and making it really bright red and really bright warm. And as he's closing the window, the kitchen lights are going up and blowing out. And that's something that is not happening, you know. It's not like the chefs all of a sudden turn on all the lights when they put stuff in the oven. But it's something that's there because of story, just to make a feeling of more scary, you know, exciting parts. Working on WALL-E, the DP was Danielle Feinberg. And, you know, this is one of my shots. And WALL-E was really interesting because all of a sudden you're working with two main characters. And WALL-E is a cube and Eve is a sphere. And not only is she a sphere, but she's white. So it's really hard to place any lights around her because she's instantly going to blow out. And you really have to be careful with those things. And that was the biggest challenge of this whole thing. WALL-E being a cube, for example, if you place a light right in front of him, because he has a flat face, basically, you're going to lose all the shaping. Everything's going to blow out as well. You know, it's going to become too bright. So you always have to place lights in the corners, you know, from the edges. So you still have a really good fall off, and you really have shaping happening and everything. Most importantly with WALL-E, and again, this room is kind of like really bright, so it's hard to see, but his eyes are made of different elements of glass. So, and his eyes, he doesn't have like your typical human-like form. So all the emotion is coming out of his eyes. So we're coming up, we have to be really careful that they're not black, because if they're black, that makes WALL-E seem dead, like without a spirit, and that goes against everything that we want to tell in story. So we're actually using constellation maps from the universe, and we're picking up different constellations and different stars and everything, and using them as reflections for the eyes. So what you actually see in the eyes as you're watching like the film, it's actually stars from real constellation maps. And that gives depth because each element of the glass is going to pick up different stars, and it gives a much more human quality to WALL-E. This is another shot. It's just a still image, but it proves that point where like the first thing you're going to notice is like Eve. And it's pretty amazing. I love this shot because they're both stuck, and he's kind of like dying. You know, you see like this slow heartbeat of WALL-E. And even with just two eyes, that facial expression is so expressive. It's so powerful. So that has to be the focus of this image. And everything else is kind of like just there to make sense that the environment is still working. So you have to worry about these things. This is a totally different project that I worked on. And it's actually filmed by some random person that I found on YouTube. And it's a theme park attraction at California Adventure Park at Disneyland. And I was approached by John Lasseter and Disney Imagineering at a certain point at Pixar to work on this super secret project, you know, that no one has ever done before. And what they were doing is that they developed this technology of water fountains that shoot up in the air like, I don't know, soccer field size, you know, and they can control the particles of water to such an amazing extent that they can actually project HD images on them and not lose any definition. So we were working on them, and Disney wanted to make a retrospective of Disney and Pixar films. So we had to bring all these old shots that we were working on, and we did Nemo, and we did all these other things. One of the shots that I worked on was this one, and because it was interesting, because we were working in this medium, and we had no way of testing it out, and we're used to working in a medium for film, for cinema. And all of a sudden, we realized throughout, like midway through the whole thing, that all the shots were looking terrible as soon as projected in the water. And that's because any black that you have is going to disappear. It's going to be transparent in water. And so basically we had to compensate for all these things to make sure that her visor still had like a solid feel to it, and his eyes would not disappear, and that when they kiss, you would see that spark. You know, it's always, again, thinking about story and thinking about what the emotion and the message is, no matter what the medium is. Because if you see this shot, like on my computer, it looks horrendous. All the blacks had to be raised to become really gray, and all the whites had to be like much lower so that they don't blow out with the projection lights pointing at the water. So there's all these things happening, and you really have to think, okay, who's going to see this, and where is it going to be? Is it going to be DVD or Blu-ray or TV? Every single thing changes. So there's a whole department at Pixar in color grading that at the end of every film has to like redo the color for every single thing so that it works on a particular medium. And now that I'm working on my own films, I have to do that myself. So it's an amazing exercise of patience, you know, to have to rethink all the things you're doing. On Up, the director of photography was J.C. Kalash. And for example, this shot is one of the first shots where you see this little kid. He's like playing outside Carl, and it's a bright, inviting, warm world. And he wants to go in because he hears like somebody play. So it's a really simple shot, but you also have to you use the elements of the composition of the door and wall just to completely frame him. Now, the crazy thing about this shot is that I've worked on this for a ton of times, and I'm working on this shot, I'm working on this film. And what I realized at a certain point when I'm in the theater actually watching the film is that there's an intersection between the balloon and the door frame. And this is crazy. It's like maybe 2 pixels wide, but it's enough to completely detract me from the story. And these are the kind of things that you typically are trying to find out as you work in a film. And they happen all the time because you have simulation of clothes, and you have the characters have to be walking on their paths. And there's all these things that are happening that, you know, no matter if I saw this 100 times, once you see it in the theater, that's the only thing I see. I see that intersection, and I'm like, well, that's a failure, you know, like everyone is going to notice that. But it's crazy. It's just one frame. This shot in particular, for example, I love how the composition is done because he's walking towards the light, and it's, again, this really bright, warm tone to it. So it's inviting, you know. It's kind of like making him comfortable with actually going in a scary house. And he's perfectly framed not only by the diagonal, but like that window over there and that bounce over there. And it's kind of like your eyes going here. You know, it's following the lower thirds of composition because you have 1/3 here, another third here, and everything is happening on this side of the image. So again, pure basics of cinematography, you know, and you have to think about that because the story has to work. If some of these details didn't work, if he wasn't in silhouette, then you would kind of like, you wouldn't be attached emotionally to what was happening. And he's going to see this person, you know, the first time he sees the person he falls in love with. And it's so important to focus the eyes on her that everything else is dark. Even though in the previous frame you saw this bright door that he was walking to, if you notice in this frame, only her is bright, like nothing else in the room. The walls back there are really dark. And I only added like these pools of lights back there so that it really framed her head with the rest of the room. Even the rope is darkening towards the edges of the frame so that really what you're focused on is here. So there's, again, all these things about story. This shot, it's one of the quickest shots that I ever worked on, and it's a light flash. It's an old light bulb, an old flash, camera flash, so I used hours of Google Images and archives to actually study how these flashes go off, you know, and how the light actually explodes and like slowly comes back into the light bulb. So if you notice in this frame, which is like right after the flash goes off, you have a certain kind of fall off on every side, and maybe a lens flare over there. And it has like different types of values of colors. It has some noise because it's actually illuminating the dust in the room. So we do all these things to kind of like make it more believable and more intense. And actually before the flash even goes off to a full white frame, what I'm doing is darkening for 2 frames all the values of the room so that it becomes much more contrasty and it becomes much more powerful. And it's all these subtle details that no one notices, but it adds so much to the spirit of a shot. Toy Story 3 was one of my favorite films that I worked on. The director of photography is Kim White. And I did so many shots on this film, but like this in particular was one of the most powerful that I worked on. And it's part of the sequence where they're like slowly going to die. And it's where all the toys are together, and they kind of like realize, looking at each other, that, you know, even if it was like the end of them all, they at least had their friends there with them, and they were kind of like united in this. And they started holding hands to each other, and it was like one of the most moving and powerful things that animation has ever done. But this shot in particular, you have a ton of trash all over the place. So it's really hard to like make sure that you focus on the emotion that you want to translate. And look at this. It's like you can barely see Rex. He's being brightly lit by the fire over here, you know, even though you have these bright values over here. You can see that Rex is falling. He's falling fast. But look at the face of Woody. It's like it tells everything that he's feeling. You know, he's looking at Rex thinking, oh my God, he's going to die. And he's like one of my best friends. And what am I going to do? And it's so important that you don't lose that emotion. So everything you do has to frame that face completely. Has to give him like a bright edge here towards where the end is going to be. But you have to see the eyes, and you have to see the mouth, and you have to get that edge exactly right so that it doesn't lose itself in this space where it's in. And this is the kind of like power that you have to go through over and over again. I worked on this shot for maybe 3 weeks just to create this. And it's so powerful. This is another shot that I worked on. And it's really fast, it's really gross. But I worked on this for 2 weeks. And you know, it has a lot of saliva, as you can see. And there's some quality to this. How do you light saliva? And how do you even create saliva? So it was a total collaboration between me and the effects artist. And the effects artist was just responsible to create this kind of particle simulation. And how is it going to light? So we actually filmed him. We picked up a glass, and we put a camera here, and we filmed him licking the glass full of saliva. And I had on my computer, like, literally, like, as I'm working on the shot, I had his face licking this glass zoomed in on the computer as well. And it's really, really gross, but it's the only way that you can see exactly what would happen, you know? And there's a certain quality to it, because when the tongue compresses against the glass, it loses some saturation, it becomes really flat. And you have to control that, otherwise you don't get that contact. And the particles of like, how you get some bright ones and like less bright ones, it's awful. But like, well, we became really good friends after that. La Luna, again, this is one of my favorite projects. It was one of the last projects I worked at Pixar. But I was given this sequence, which is the main sequence where, you know, he hits the star and this thing explodes into 1 billion different stars. And this is right before he falls in slow motion, the shot that I already showed you. And it's such a significant thing because it's that moment where he goes against what his dad and grandparent is like doing, and he kind of like finds himself through the whole process. So I was approached, when I was working in this, I was approached by the art director and the director, and they were kind of like, you know, we want something magical, something really painterly, but we're not really sure what you should be doing. We're not really sure how you should approach this. But I asked for some pastels reference, and the art director, he's a painter, and he did this amazing pastels where he created this incredible quality to the rays of light. So if I look at the shot, this is right before he hits the star, and this is the one after. And what I saw in the pastel is that he created this really painterly look to rays of light. And it's not something that would typically happen. You know, you typically happen like a gloom like this, a bloom like this really bright, and just like a uniform ball of fire coming from the star or something. But we wanted something very Miyazaki. So our main inspiration was Miyazaki. And so we used this thing, and I actually went frame by frame, and I was drawing these things. And I actually drew frame by frame in the shot to create exactly that same feeling. So in this shot, for example, right after, you still have those elements that are completely irregular, But you have, I'm controlling the fall off on the edges. I'm controlling the breaks that you see, the noise patterns that come, all around, and how they like fade towards the glow over here and the bright star over there. And it's all things that I did it manually. I was like painting for like a week or two, and I showed it to the art director, and they completely fell in love with it because it's exactly what they wanted to do. It's like this magical, unique experience that really translates what the little kid was going through. And since now with my new company, I'm kind of like doing more live action, and I wanted to touch on some of my favorite live action films from last year. And this is from Lincoln. And if you look at it, it's just like mind-blowing what they did here. This is the last walk that Lincoln takes on the White House before he eventually gets shot. So it's an extremely powerful shot. And he uses elements from Stanley Kubrick where everything is like happening symmetrically. And you have these frames framing him on the screen, these lamps. And he's like one of the most famous silhouettes in American history. So this is really important that he has that bright light over there, kind of like shadowing him on the ground. And he's walking towards his death. Not only that, it goes to the extreme of using all these green wallpaper tones. When you see the film, if you notice, after he gets shot, his death scene, when he's like on his deathbed, everything is green. So he's actually creating an emotional connection between this shot, which signifies his last walk before his death, to his actually when he dies. So all these elements are all on purpose, not to only guide your eye, but to also connect the story emotionally and become more powerful. They're also not afraid of blowing out windows, which is typically a no-no in cinema, But they're using that because your eye is immediately going to go to this window, not that window. And this is so bright, but you instantly see his like silhouette over here and like some details on the table and all that stuff, but it's all about that. It's all about guiding our eye over there. And it's what you do in cinematography. It's exactly about painting an image in front of you with lights and shadows and knowing how to do that. This one shows an example of how they make his face the brightest face in the whole frame. So they actually use makeup to desaturate his facial features and skin. And if you watch the movie again, throughout the whole film, he's always the brightest face in the room. Because again, your eye is going to go to the brightest spot in the film. So they do that emotionally, and it's so successful. Skyfall, another amazing film. And Roger Deakins was like the cinematographer for this, and he was actually working with us on WALL-E. And this is so simple, it's just like has these lines connecting to this middle, and the brightest is like him. And even though he's arrested, he knows that he's free. He's like the most powerful because he's the brightest there. And James Bond, the only light illuminating him is the light that's coming from him. So it's kind of like he's more powerful than James Bond. So everything has like this second guessing that's happening. It's like really telling you the message of the film through light. Cinematography here, again, James Bond starts from completely dark, and he walks to the camera, and all of a sudden his eyes are seen. That's an amazing thing that would never happen in person. Like, what are the odds of you walking into a pool of light on your eyes? But it just gives you like the complete sense of power that he has, of the control, while not losing the silhouette of the gun. Even though it's out of focus, you see it there. Life of Pi, they just won cinematography yesterday for the Oscars. And it's like a mind-blowing film if you haven't seen it. And in this particular image, it's so simple, but it's so well composed, so balanced, because you have the boat here where the tiger is, and you have the kid over here, and they're all floating in heaven, kind of. So it kind of brings this spiritual element to the whole thing. Even though they're in ocean, and they're complete opposites because they're afraid of each other, they kind of like are at peace with themselves right here. And it's such a powerful scene. On this one, when the ship is sinking, I hope I'm not giving spoilers, if you haven't seen it. I should have said that before I started the talk. Sorry about that. But he's like floating in the ocean, just basically watching the boat sink and everyone die, And it's amazing how they use these highlights to control where your eye goes and to control that emotion. So to finish off, I want to talk about dots. And typically, people like to look at their life like this, kind of like a timeline. I typically like to look at my life just of random events happening every now and then. you know, and this might be like when I started at Pixar or when I met Steve Jobs or when I made a movie. I don't know. It could be anything, you know. And the thing is, when you're going through your life, all these things are happening that you have no idea how they're going to connect in the future. And you have to embrace that. You got to believe that someday they're going to connect. And someday they start connecting, you know? Like that first Mac, for example, that I saw, eventually I got to meet Steve Jobs and actually in person thank him for creating something that changed my life. And all these things keep happening all the time. Like he was the CEO of Pixar, so eventually I ended up being like working for him, you know, and who knows like what other connections I made over there. A few years ago, I was in a concert line in San Francisco, and I met some random people that were there, and we became like friends for the concert, you know, like I never saw them again in life. And 2 weeks ago, I was watching Kickstarter, and they just released like this amazing nonprofit on Kickstarter that was hugely successful. So I sent them an email, and we hadn't spoken for 7 years. Sent them an email, and I was like, oh my God, I work in video. I just saw what you did. Like, this is awesome. And they were like, oh, you work in video? We kind of need a video artist to like help us out. So for a few weeks now, we've been like sitting together at an incubator in San Francisco and like just brainstorming ideas that they can use to promote their company. And this is from a connection that I made years ago. Like, who knew, you know? So like, I want you to understand that fully, because all these connections, all these things that are happening, it's all about life. And you're here at this amazing conference that's being like organized for you. And you get so many chances not only to meet your colleagues and make new connections, meet like people that you admire. And you really should be thankful to all those organizers that you see wearing the orange t-shirts, because they do amazing things for you. And I want you to finish off really quickly to say, be smart about your studies, be smart about everything you choose, work really hard, like you always have to give your best, and most importantly, have fun. And I want to mention this guy here. This guy was like the co-creator of 1984 commercial for Apple. Like this Super Bowl commercial, it was an amazing commercial. So he's like a total design genius in the commercial and ad community. And he's such a genius that somebody on Twitter created this account so you can follow his beard. And like this guy just basically like spits out this wisdom, you know, these quotes that are so wise and so like inspiring. So you should really follow that. And one of the things that he said was that greatness is never achieved by refining mediocrity. And I really believe in this, because you always have to give your very best, no matter what it is. Because it all comes down to this. If you decide to give your very best, you're just risking not really liking the result. But if you don't even try, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you're not going to like it. So you should always try to go for that. And finally, I want to finish with Steve Jobs, who said this. If you live each day like it was your last, you'll probably be right one day. You know, you're probably going to die one day. And this is so true. I live my life like this. You know, life's too short. You don't know what's going to happen. And it's so important that you kind of like have this fearless attitude to go for broke and like just try everything. That's how companies get made. That's how you have to fight really hard. So meet each other, talk to whatever you guys are doing. If you want to create apps, talk to other people that might help you create apps. If you're like technical, join with somebody who's creative and try to blend ideas together. Brainstorm, brainstorm, brainstorm. So work really hard and go for that. And that's my talk. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. So I don't know if we have time for questions, but okay. I run a little bit overboard, sorry. I get excited.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the talk. It was amazing.
Thank you.
One of my questions was about Ratatouille. There are some shots there where everything is black. He's just smelling the food, and yet, even though the background is completely dark, you can kind of see just the character. But even the smells that are going around, they're kind of bouncing some light off of him. One of my questions was, how do you achieve that effect? And also, other two things, Paris at Night, that was gorgeous. Those shots are amazing when he's on the rooftop talking to the chef and all. And particularly the food shots, because normally the kitchen is just gray and white, and they're all wearing white, and even the mice are gray and brown. But whenever there's a shot of the actual food, even though it's not like realistic if you look at food, but it just looks so vibrant and good, and you just want to jump into the movie. And
that's good.
And those are my questions. How do you achieve all of those effects? And thank you for doing what you do, and please keep working.
Thank you. Those are really good questions. It's like everything on Ratatouille was with the premise that we had one of the biggest challenges ever, because you have food, which everyone knows about food and eats them, and you have rats, which everyone kind of hates. And somehow we needed to blend the two together and create something that somehow people were not grossed out by having all these rats cooking the food, but they actually wanted to eat the food and enjoy the food. We wanted people to leave the theaters feeling hungry. So that was the main goal, and we always had that in our minds. To answer your first question, all the blacks and all that stuff, we typically, when we work with darker environments, we try to make the darker environments really saturated, because that gives a certain warmth to the whole thing. And a typical shot on Ratatouille was extremely hard, because the total number of lights that we had to deal with on the computer, on one of the kitchen shots, for example, we had maybe 700 lights. So you have lights not only to illuminate the environment, but you have lights to illuminate each character. Each character has maybe 20 lights just around them, really shaping every single detail. And the food, even more so, because you have not only illuminating the standard food, if it's a fish or something, but you have to create certain highlights, to make it juicy and exciting, So you have to really worry about this. And mostly everyone at Pixar actually had cooking classes for Ratatouille to really learn what was happening on the kitchen, and learn from actual professional chefs what they did and how they approached food and what food looked like. So we had tons and tons of photography done, high-res photography, so we could really look at all the quality of all the elements. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you. And and that's it's one of those things that it's only done for the story to really reinforce the emotion of what he was going through, So thanks. Appreciate that.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
I wanted to know if you ever missed having some kind of background in cinema, because you come from computer science. I also want to work in cinema, and I come from computer science, and I always wonder if I should do something like a master or something that has to do with cinema. Did you ever miss it?
That's a really good question. I feel there's something wrong happening in universities that don't allow students that do technical degrees to actually do classes that are creative as well. I feel like you learn much more and you become a much better technical person if you also exercise your creative side of the brain. So no matter if you want to do just programming, pure programming, if you have classes that kind of bring a whole different perspective on things, you're much more able to even create creative solutions to problems that you never thought of before. So not only do I think that you as students should try to really bring that to a university level, or at least on a personal level. If you cannot do that here at the university, you should take classes outside to really bring that forth, and practice. But in terms of specifics about me, it's an if scenario, It's not like I can really complain, because I just did computer science and I've worked in some of the best film studios in the world. So I believe anything is possible as long as you work really, really hard and keep yourself motivated to go for that, and practice on your own. Even if I don't have a camera with me, I walk around and I I'm always thinking about how would I frame the scene if I had a camera with me? How would I what do I like about the light here? You know, what would I do differently? So I'm always trying to exercise my brain as I walk around, which might annoy a lot of people because I just shut down and I don't talk to anyone. But it's it's good for you as an artist to do that, you know? And honestly, now that I'm starting my own company and I'm working on my own films, possibly if I had had a cinema degree, that would have totally propelled me forward much faster. Because now I'm having a big challenge of learning a lot about filmmaking in a totally different level, you know? I'm learning about producing, and I'm learning about how to dealing with the whole Hollywood machine in California and all that stuff. And it's something that I've never really been exposed to before, but it's one of those things. You gotta learn, I mean, with what you have, right? So I'm giving it all my best, and maybe it's a total failure, and I'll be working at Starbucks in a year, but even if it is, it's okay, you know, because you learn from that. And the next time you do it, it will be better. So, you know, that's my philosophy about it.
Thank you.
It's up to you guys.
Hi.
Hi.
Aren't movies ruined for you? I mean, instead of being entertained by a movie, your brain is always decomposing everything.
Pretty much.
And noticing things that you're not supposed to notice.
You know, it's hard. If I watch, especially if I watch an animated film or if I watch a film with visual effects, because I worked in visual effects as well, it's really hard for me to not notice everything that's wrong in the film, or start thinking about how would I do it differently. So it's almost like I have to rewatch the film to be able to distance myself a little bit. That happened when I watched The Hobbit recently, for example. You know, I admired all the work that was into it, but at the same time, I was thinking the whole way through, I was just admiring all the work that went into it. You know, I wasn't just watching the story, watching a film. So typically, I end up watching it several times until I'm able to really just casually watch a film. And it's tough, but it's kind of it comes with the, you know, with the game. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you guys any other questions, anything, feel free to email me, Twitter, whatever you want. If I don't reply immediately, send me again after a week and I'll talk to you. So don't give up. Feel free to email me with questions and stuff. All right. Thanks for coming.